When German prisoners of war discovered that they were allowed to say no without immediate punishment, hesitation spread through the camp, not as relief or rebellion, but as a quiet realization that a single refusal could shift everything they thought they understood about captivity, authority, and their own limits. As the days unfolded within the familiar routines of the camp, the men began to notice a subtle change that did not announce itself through orders or confrontation, but through the absence of reaction. Requests were made and ignored, instructions were offered and quietly declined, and for the first time since their capture, nothing followed. No raised voices, no threats, and no punishment arrived to restore the expected balance. At first, this absence felt deceptive. Refusal had always carried consequence, and consequence had shaped behavior more effectively than fear alone. The idea that one could simply decline an instruction without immediate reprisal felt unnatural, almost dangerous, as if the lack of response itself were part of a larger test. The men waited for correction, certain that authority would reassert itself the moment someone stepped too far. But it did not. Small acts of hesitation accumulated quietly. A task left unfinished, a request delayed, a refusal offered without explanation. Each moment passed without comment or correction. What unsettled the men was not the freedom to refuse, but the silence that followed it. Silence created uncertainty, and uncertainty demanded interpretation. The camp did not descend into disorder. Instead, it held its shape. Men continued to move within familiar boundaries, gathering in expected places and following patterns that no longer required instruction. The refusal of a single order did not collapse the system, and this realization introduced a new kind of tension, one rooted not in fear of punishment, but in uncertainty about what authority still meant. Some prisoners observed carefully rather than acting. They watched how others responded, measured the space between refusal and consequence, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. No one celebrated defiance, and no one condemned it. The absence of reaction suggested that refusal was possible, but not without cost, even if that cost remained undefined. That undefined cost was the most unsettling part. Without clear consequences, the men could no longer rely on external rules to guide their decisions. Each refusal became a personal calculation, weighing risk without guidance. Saying no longer meant disobedience in the traditional sense, but it also did not mean safety. It existed in a gray space that required judgment the men had not practiced in years. As more refusals passed unnoticed, the meaning of authority began to blur. Orders still existed, but their power had weakened. They could be followed or ignored, and the outcome appeared unchanged. This ambiguity altered the relationship between the prisoners and the system that had once controlled them completely. By the end of this phase, the men understood something had shifted, even if they could not name it. The ability to refuse had not liberated them, but it had unsettled the structure that defined captivity. Authority no longer felt absolute, and obedience no longer felt automatic. In that uncertainty, a new tension emerged, not between prisoners and guards, but within the prisoners themselves, as they began to confront a question they had long avoided, which was not whether they were allowed to say no, but what saying no would ultimately require of them. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically, and that the freedom to say no did not arrive as relief, but as responsibility, and responsibility demanded a kind of confidence they no longer trusted themselves to possess. Refusal, once imagined as a form of resistance, revealed itself as a decision that could not be shared or avoided once it was made. Those who refused first did not appear stronger or more defiant than the others. They did not raise their voices or seek attention. Their refusals were quiet, almost reluctant, offered without explanation and followed by stillness. What made these moments unsettling was not the act itself, but the reaction of those watching, because everyone waited to see what would happen next, and nothing ever did. This absence of response forced the men to confront something unfamiliar. Without punishment to define limits, refusal lost its clarity. It was no longer an act against authority, but an act within oneself. Each man had to decide whether he would follow an instruction, not because it was enforced, but because he chose to. This shift placed responsibility where it had not existed before, and responsibility felt heavier than obedience ever had. The men began to notice how refusal changed relationships inside the camp. A man who declined an order drew quiet attention, not admiration or hostility, but observation. Others measured his behavior against their own hesitation, wondering whether they should do the same or remain within familiar patterns. No one encouraged refusal openly, and no one discouraged it either. The lack of guidance turned every decision into a personal test. As refusals continued without consequence, tension grew rather than faded. The men realized that saying no did not remove expectations. It merely transferred them inward. To refuse meant accepting uncertainty without the protection of rules. To comply meant preserving familiarity even when enforcement had disappeared. Neither option offered comfort, and this imbalance created a quiet strain that settled into daily life. Some men attempted to compromise. They delayed compliance rather than refusing outright, adjusting behavior in small ways that allowed them to feel some control without committing fully. These half measures became common, offering the illusion of choice while avoiding the risk of open refusal. In this way, hesitation replaced defiance, and caution replaced conviction. The camp remained orderly, but the order felt different. It was no longer anchored in fear, but in calculation. Men weighed each instruction not against punishment, but against consequence they could not define. This constant evaluation required attention and restraint, creating a mental fatigue that obedience had once relieved. Over time, refusal began to lose its appeal, not because it was forbidden, but because it demanded too much clarity. Saying no required accepting responsibility for what followed, even when nothing followed at all. The men learned that freedom without direction was not empowering, but exhausting. By the end of this stage, the right to refuse had not transformed the camp. It had transformed the men's relationship with themselves. Obedience was no longer automatic, but refusal was no longer satisfying. Between these two states, the men found themselves suspended, navigating a space where choice existed, but certainty did not. And in that space, many discovered that saying no was not an escape from captivity, but another burden to carry, one that weighed silently on every decision they made, on the individual, quietly reshaping how the group functioned as a whole. What had started as isolated moments of hesitation slowly influenced shared expectations, altering the rhythm that once guided behavior without anyone needing to discuss it. The presence of choice introduced uncertainty into relationships that had previously relied on predictability. Men could no longer assume that instructions would be followed automatically, and this uncertainty changed how they perceived one another. A refusal did not signal rebellion, but disrupted the unspoken agreement that kept daily life smooth. Each instance forced others to reconsider their own position, creating a ripple effect that traveled through the camp without ever becoming visible. This shift produced caution rather than conflict. No arguments broke out, and no factions formed, yet the sense of alignment that once held the group together weakened. Men watched one another more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to anticipate change. The ability to predict behavior had been replaced by the need to interpret intention. An interpretation required attention that had not been necessary before. Over time, this attention became exhausting. The men realized that freedom to refuse demanded constant awareness of how one's choices might affect the fragile balance they all depended on. A single refusal could introduce uncertainty into a system that relied on quiet cooperation. As a result, many chose compliance not because they believed in the orders, but because compliance preserved harmony. Refusal began to feel isolating. Those who declined instructions sensed the subtle distance that followed, not as punishment, but as a natural response to disruption. Others did not challenge or criticize them, yet the shared rhythm adjusted slightly, leaving the refuser out of step. This misalignment carried emotional weight, reinforcing the idea that choice, while permitted, came with a social cost. Gradually, the group adapted. Unspoken norms emerged, guiding when refusal felt acceptable and when it felt inappropriate. These norms were never articulated, yet they influenced behavior more effectively than rules. Men learned to read the mood of the group, timing their actions to avoid tension. And in doing so, they restored a sense of order that choice had temporarily unsettled. The camp found equilibrium again, but it was different from before. Order no longer depended on strict obedience, but on mutual consideration. The men adjusted themselves not to satisfy authority, but to maintain cohesion. In this way, refusal did not dismantle control. It redistributed it across the group, embedding it within relationships rather than rules. By this stage, the ability to say no had lost its disruptive power. Choice still existed, but it was now filtered through the need to belong. The men understood that freedom exercised without regard for others could destabilize the environment they relied on for survival. As a result, many limited their own choices voluntarily, restoring predictability at the cost of autonomy. In this quiet transformation, the camp revealed another unsettling truth. Freedom does not always divide people from systems. Sometimes it binds them more tightly to one another. The men were no longer controlled by orders alone, but by the shared responsibility of keeping life manageable, proving that even when refusal is allowed, its consequences can reshape behavior in ways no one initially expects. Did not resemble the rigid obedience of earlier days, yet produced the same outcome through different means. Without commands being enforced and without refusals being punished, behavior slowly aligned again, guided not by fear, but by the desire to preserve stability. The men noticed that instructions were increasingly followed without discussion, not because they were binding, but because ignoring them risked unsettling the fragile equilibrium the group had rebuilt. Compliance became a practical response rather than an imposed one, chosen to avoid the uncertainty that refusal introduced in shared routines. In this way, obedience returned quietly, stripped of coercion but reinforced by consequence that existed only in social space. This form of obedience felt reasonable. Men told themselves they were choosing cooperation, that they were acting in the interest of calm and predictability, and that these choices reflected maturity rather than submission. The absence of force made compliance appear voluntary, even ethical, masking the fact that alternatives had narrowed without anyone declaring them forbidden. Over time, the memory of refusal faded. The possibility of saying no remained, but it was no longer present in daily thought. It existed as an option in theory, not in practice, overshadowed by the convenience of following along. Each day that passed without refusal reinforced the idea that compliance was the sensible default, and default behavior soon felt natural. The group itself became the measure of correctness. Men observed one another's actions, mirrored behavior that maintained calm, and avoided anything that might disrupt it. This mutual alignment required no coordination because it grew from shared experience and unspoken agreement. Standing apart, even briefly, felt unnecessary when blending in promised ease. What made this transformation especially enduring was its invisibility. There were no signs of enforcement to resist and no authority to challenge. Control no longer had a face or a voice, which made it difficult to recognize, let alone oppose. The men experienced themselves as free, even as their behavior grew increasingly predictable. As routines solidified, the camp regained its rhythm. Tasks were completed, schedules observed, and order maintained without instruction. The structure that had once relied on external power now sustained itself through internal consensus. Obedience had not disappeared. It had changed its source. By this stage, the men understood that refusal was allowed, yet rarely exercised, not because it was dangerous, but because it complicated life. Simplicity favored compliance, and simplicity had become the most valued condition in a world stripped of clear direction. In this way, the camp revealed a subtle truth. Authority does not always need to command to be effective. Sometimes it only needs to withdraw, allowing people to rebuild order in ways that feel voluntary, reasonable, and self-chosen, even as those choices quietly limit the range of what feels possible. The ability to refuse had lost its significance, not because it was taken away, but because it no longer changed anything. Saying no did not disrupt the system, challenge authority, or alter outcomes in a meaningful way, and without impact, refusal became an empty gesture. The camp continued to function smoothly regardless of individual choices. Tasks were completed whether instructions were followed enthusiastically or reluctantly, and daily life unfolded without interruption. This consistency sent a powerful message, one that did not need to be spoken, which was that participation was assumed and absence of participation made little difference. In this environment, refusal ceased to feel like agency and began to feel like isolation. The men sensed that their choices now existed within narrow boundaries. They could refuse an order, but doing so separated them from the rhythm that sustained the group. Compliance allowed them to remain invisible, to move through days without friction, and to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Refusal, by contrast, demanded explanation, even when none was asked for, and explanation carried emotional cost. Over time, the desire to avoid that cost outweighed the desire to exercise choice. Men began complying automatically, not because they believed in the instructions, but because compliance simplified life. It reduced uncertainty, preserved cohesion, and required no justification. The option to refuse remained in theory, yet in practice it faded into irrelevance. What made this stage especially final was the absence of conflict. No struggle marked the transition, and no resistance signaled loss. The men did not feel defeated because nothing had been taken from them explicitly. Instead, they adapted, reshaping their behavior to fit a system that no longer needed enforcement. Control had become ambient, present everywhere without being visible anywhere. The camp reached a state of quiet equilibrium. Everyone understood what was expected, even though nothing was demanded. The rules that mattered were not written or spoken, but felt, reinforced through repetition and shared experience. In this equilibrium, change felt unnecessary and disruption felt irresponsible. By the time the men reflected on how this had happened, it no longer seemed surprising. They had been given the freedom to refuse, and in response, they had chosen the comfort of predictability. Saying no had not failed because it was forbidden, but because it asked too much of people who had learned to survive by minimizing risk. In the end, the most unsettling realization was not that obedience had returned, but that it had returned without resistance, carried forward by the quiet understanding that life was easier when nothing needed to be challenged, and that sometimes the greatest loss of freedom occurs not when choice is denied, but when choice no longer feels worth using in any visible way. The choice remained, unchanged and technically available, yet it slowly lost its weight as the men adapted to a system where exercising it no longer altered outcomes or offered relief. The camp did not tighten its grip, and authority did not return in force. Instead, daily life continued smoothly, shaped by routines that felt familiar and manageable. In that continuity, refusal became unnecessary, not because it was forbidden, but because it disrupted a balance that now felt essential to preserving calm. What the men discovered was unsettling in its simplicity. Freedom does not vanish only when it is denied. It can fade quietly when it stops mattering. When saying no leads nowhere, when it changes nothing, and when it isolates rather than empowers, the option remains unused, slowly receding from daily thought. The absence of conflict made this process almost invisible. There was no struggle to remember, no loss to mourn, and no authority to blame. The men did not feel controlled because no one was controlling them directly. They felt practical, cautious, and aligned with what seemed reasonable in their circumstances. In this way, the camp revealed a deeper truth about human behavior under prolonged constraint. When people learn to survive by minimizing risk, they may carry that instinct forward even after control has loosened. Choice becomes a burden, and predictability becomes safety. The story does not end with rebellion or liberation, but with quiet acceptance, leaving behind a question that lingers beyond the camp itself. How much freedom depends not on whether choice exists, but on whether people still believe that using it will make a difference. And in that realization, the most powerful form of control is revealed, not as force or fear, but as a condition where freedom remains present, yet no longer feels worth exercising. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.